So this week I wanted to look at, when we were looking at sort of criminals and who we cover. I've been watching this event unfold in Ukraine, and what Vladimir Putin's doing has been a topic of conversation with the people I've been rolling with, as far as why the hell is this even happening? Because I think Ukraine and Russia are considered fairly modern countries. We know people who've been to Kiev, and I've been to Moscow, and these do not seem like places that would have a full-on war as far as the modern world's concerned. So it's a very intriguing story. And I thought, looking at Vladimir Putin as a possible criminal, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at an interview that he did 8 months ago, but also take a look at his recent speech to the Russian people to try to derive some understanding of what's going on, and maybe try to read into what he is thinking, because that is the question I think a lot of people are asking, is why is this happening?
Yeah. I mean, it seemed to kind of escalate very, if you paid attention to the region, you know that there's been sort of an ongoing tension between Ukraine and Russia, obviously dating back to the annexation of Crimea. What was that, 2014? But still, it did kind of seem to escalate rapidly and seemingly, I don't want to say quite out of nowhere, but like it seemed from going like, okay, you're kind of aware that the two countries don't like each other necessarily, or that there's some more that Russia has its eye on Ukraine, to all of a sudden, kaboom, like here we are.
Yeah. And I think with a lot of these things, and maybe my older Sean or younger Sean, meaning a previous Sean, didn't have the intellectual curiosity he has now, speaking about myself in the third person. But I didn't realize that when Crimea had happened, and this isn't a justification for anything, it's just something I think is important to the narrative. The people in Crimea had an independently sanctioned referendum, which it's in eastern Ukraine. It's a highly Russian identifying part of that country. And part of that annexation was Vladimir Putin's saving the people who have asked for independence and to be part of Mother Russia, I guess. Which I didn't realize that. That doesn't make it right. It's just a key point that I didn't realize until I started looking at this, because I was trying to understand what was the motivation of Putin and what justifies you to fire on people that are effectively, from the same, I guess, heritage, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, well, go ahead.
I was going to say, so we have an interview from 8 months ago, an NBC News interview, and we're going to play the speech from Putin. But there's one thing you saw in the interview right off the bat, which was interesting, that isn't directly related to Russia, and I noted it as well separately. I thought it was a cringy, interesting part of the interview. Do you want to introduce this bit?
Right. Well, early on in the interview, as and I'm sorry, I don't recall the name of the reporter.
I don't know what it is. Let me check while you're introducing it.
Okay. Yes, it's Keir Simmons.
Keir Simmons. Yes.
All right. Anyway, Keir Simmons is kind of walking Putin through some questions about like the current state of things, and obviously one of them, this interview being, as you said, 8 months ago, Joe Biden was relatively new as being the president of the United States. So you're sort of asking first about Donald Trump and then about Biden, and trying to get Putin to make comparisons and discuss it. And then introduces it at this juncture that apparently when Joe Biden was vice president of the United States, that Biden himself claims that he went and shook hands with Vladimir Putin and looked into his eyes. And when he saw, whatever he saw in Vladimir Putin's eyes, he said to Vladimir Putin directly, "I don't see a soul," or "I don't see a soul behind those eyes," something like that, which is, except that Joe Biden himself apparently claims that he says this. It's remarkable to think, I have to say, that a politician would actually say something that inflammatory. I mean, like, it's pretty nuts. But of course, Biden's not known for pulling his punches in some senses, but more importantly, he's not known for his verbal acuity all the time. Like, I don't know. It seems like an odd thing to do. But then Vladimir Putin's response is even stranger and stuff. I mean, like, if someone said that about me or you, what would you say, right?
You know what? This is the only time in this whole episode I'm going to defend Vladimir Putin. That is the right gangster shit to say when somebody asks you a silly thing like that or says something like that. I find it just to be, I think it's a bit of theater created by Joe Biden that's a bit embellished. And here's the quote from Reuters. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm looking into your eyes and I don't think you have a soul, which that could be taken in a lot of different ways. And there's a lot of context and a lot of part of the conversation they may have had that's looking at that. He looked back at me and he smiled and he said, we understand one another. So to me, it just seems like, and this is a very, I think, a Putin thing to do from watching his interviews, is he is somebody who doesn't mind winding people up.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's such an innocuous thing, which is why I found this part of the interview somewhat cringy, because it didn't serve any purpose.
You think it's cringy though because the Keir Simmons raised the question?
Yes, I think it's such an innocuous, dumbass question. I
don't know. I found Vladimir Putin's response to be cringy and weird.
Oh, in this interview, I'm talking about his response to Biden.
Wait,
if that response to Biden was true, to be fair,
I know he doesn't recall. Putin doesn't recall the exchange, so he doesn't talk about what his response to Biden was. He's only reacting to. Well, he's reacting to the question, but I think that Putin's reaction to the question in this interview is odd.
Well, let's take a look at it, because I remember when I watched it, I just remember thinking this interviewer is losing a bit of credibility with me at this moment in time.
Okay, all right. Well,
let's see. Let's play it out here.
When you met, you were inches away from each other, close to each other, and he said to you, "I'm looking in your eyes, and I can't see a soul." And you said, "We understand each other." Do you remember that exchange?
As far as soul, I'm not sure. One has to think about what soul is.
Stop right there.
I do not remember.
No, you don't. Like, you know what I mean? What? Like, that's such an equivalent. I mean, like, maybe he's just screwing with the interviewer, if that's your point. You know, like.
Well, I think he's screwing with Biden, but I think for me, it's such a nonsense.
Biden, apparently, he said we understand each other. You know, like, I mean, that's the badass. You know, okay, like, okay, yeah. We understand.
I just feel like it's such a. He's replying in kind, or it's not a serious question in my view. You know, how to me, it's not surprising Putin would say something like that, and I really don't care. Okay. And I think Putin is like, this is worth your time. This, I'm just going to give you, this is the first thing I'm thinking about, because this is such a bullshit question. I'm not going to answer it seriously. That's kind of what that's how I took it.
Okay. That's interesting. Keep playing.
Remember this particular part of our conversations, to be honest with you. I do not remember.
Because keep in mind, the translation may not be quite capturing this.
Well, fair enough.
And I just, the way he said that, it's like, what do you mean by soul?
Yeah, but keep playing.
We all, when we meet, when we get together, when we talk, when we work, we strive and achieve for some solutions. We all proceed from the interests of our nations and our states, and this is fundamental and is the bedrock of all our actions and intentions. And this is the driving force and the motive for organizing meetings of this kind. And as far as soul goes, that's something for the church.
But hold on. Now he has to follow up.
Okay, so I'm okay with that answer. Again, to anybody watching this, I'm not a Putin supporter. We're talking about this one question in isolation. So you can be a dick in the comments, but that's just me commenting.
Yeah, you're a religious man.
Not you, Dixon. You can be a dick to me in person.
Oh, yeah,
but anybody watching this can clearly be a dick to me in the comments. I have no problem with that.
Back up the video for a second, though, because get his full question in, Keir Simmons.
Yeah. What was the timestamp of the original?
15:25, I think it was.
Let me go back to that, just so we can go back and everybody can take it all in.
You want to get the whole rhythm of this exchange.
When you met, you were inches away from each other, close to each other. And he said to you, "I'm looking in your eyes, and I can't see a soul." And you said, "We understand each other." Do you remember that exchange?
As As far as soul, I'm not sure. One has to think about what soul is, but I do not remember this particular part of our conversations, to be honest with you. I do not remember. We all, when we meet, when we get together, when we talk, when we work, we strive and achieve for some solutions. We all proceed from the interests of our nations and our states, and this is fundamental and is the bedrock of all our actions and intentions. And this is the driving force and the motive for organizing meetings of this kind. And as far as soul goes, that's something for the church.
Yeah, you're a religious man. President Biden is saying he told you to your face, you don't have a soul.
I do not remember this.
He says it was 10 years
Maybe
ago.
there's
10 years
something
ago when
wrong
he was vice president, he says.
with my memory. Well, he probably has a good memory. I do not rule this out, but I don't remember this. Generally, in personal encounters, people try to act appropriately. I do not remember any inappropriate elements of behavior on the part of my counterparts. I don't think that anything like that has happened.
Would you have felt that was an inappropriate thing to say?
How would you answer that question?
Well, yes, of
Yeah.
course. Keep playing.
Смотря в каком контексте, смотря в какой
Well,
форме.
that depends on the context. It depends on what form they're said in.
По-разному это всё сказать.
You know, one can say it in different ways. It can be
Stop right
presented.
there. That's what I'm talking about. This is a bizarre. It's a bizarre thing for Joe Biden to have claimed to have done, for sure. But it's also a bizarre answer. Well, I don't know about soul. You have to define soul. I mean, this is like, to me, a great tell. You at like, let's say I'm investigating you for a murder, and I say, Sean, did you murder your wife? And you say, well, what's the definition of murder? And I got to think about it. I mean, certainly I liked my wife, and and it's not appropriate to think that way. But I mean, there's like if I came up to you and said, Sean, I don't think you have a soul, and being dead serious, not like like two dudes joking over beers.
Yeah.
How would you react to that? And I would, I think it would be completely fair for him to say, now maybe he doesn't want to show any emotional weakness or whatever, but honestly, that would be an opportunity for him to garner some sympathy. Instead, like what he seems to do is start talking about we're going to play like Thomas Aquinas here. What's the definition of a soul? And, it depends on the context. Maybe that's perfectly fine. I mean, what the fuck?
Well,
that says to me, he has, I said Mephistopheles before. I don't know if you caught that reference, but that's,
No.
I'm teaching the play to my students this week, Dr. Faustus. And Dr. Faustus conjures Satan. That's what he does.
Yeah.
Well, he conjures the devil. And in this case, he sends a client demon named Mephistopheles. And at one point, therefore, Faustus starts asking him questions like, who are you? Where did you come from? What's the soul? And Mephistopheles does the same kind of equivocating, it's here. Where are you right now? I'm in hell, but this is earth. Oh, well, it's like everywhere I go is hell. Like all this kind of left turn sort of, refusal to be pinned down on a specific answer. When Faustus finally says to him something like, well, who created the world? He's like, I won't say. Because he doesn't want to name God, right? I mean, I'm looking at Mephistopheles right here. That's what I'm thinking.
I've listened to this answer a few times now, and this is a highly trained ex-KGB agent who's highly intelligent.
Sure.
And this is a power play answer in my view. Okay. So by not remembering this conversation, one, it's a very the conversation.
If that conversation happened, there's no way he doesn't remember it.
Well, okay. So if he remembers it, it's not an important thing for him to remember. And the point being that he is so important in this paradigm that Joe Biden felt it necessary to raise it to show that he's got clout. And by him not remembering it, puts him in the position of power, because Joe Biden in his conversations, he does it in a really clever way. He does it diplomatically. He's like, look, Joe Biden's got a good memory. if he says it happened, it may have happened. I just simply don't remember. But he then goes and he scores points on Joe Biden by saying, who would say stupid shit like that in a diplomatic meeting anyway?
Right.
And it's
no, you're right there. I agree with you that.
I look at this as a very cleverly, because it's a very off-putting question. And again, I want to stress, I am not a Putin supporter. I'm just giving a bit of context into this is a very savvy, intelligent individual who's just taken a question that fairly nonsensical and he's turned it into a power play of sorts. That's kind of how I'm reading this.
I mean, yeah, that's compelling. I'll give you that. But at the same time, like, I don't know. I guess, showing that he's unfazed by the question, unfazed by the memory of it, that in fact it's beneath his notice. He doesn't remember it. Might be a good way of handling it. I think like if you want to destabilize Joe Biden, though, you could say, you know what? Yeah, I remember that exchange, and I remember thinking, who the fuck is this guy? You know what I mean? Like, I'm here with honest intentions, or I'm not here to like give away the store, but I came to this thing. I thought we're having an open conversation. We're here to discuss ideas. We're here to be serious about trying to negotiate continuing world conditions that will guarantee peace and prosperity for my country, for his country. Yeah. And he opens with this nonsense about my soul. What kind of a jackass is that? You know what I mean?
Like, thinking though, he's got to be thinking, like, if this question happened, if this actually happened, and this isn't Joe Biden just sort of embellishing a story that he thought he remembered.
Yeah.
Like, he must be thinking to Joe Biden, do you know who I am? I'm Vladimir Putin. I'm Vladimir fucking Putin. Do you know how many bodies I've stepped on to get to this position without blinking an eye? And you're asking me if I have a soul? I don't have a fucking soul. Jesus Christ. Who are your intel people? And it's like, you know what it is maybe it's not the interviewer and the question of the context. I just find the whole idea that the vice president of the United States actually asked that question to Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, it's not great. It's like Lindsey Graham calling for his assassination this week. Listen, I think he was saying something that lots and lots of people are thinking, but Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Lindsey Graham, you cannot say that out loud. You are a senator. Heavens to Betsy.
What makes this interview interesting, and just to sort of fast forward it to today, and I saw it on another true crime channel, it's the Body Language panel, where they were taking apart his body language and talking about, how he's acting and his behaviors. But this interview happened 8 months ago, and I thought there was some questions in there that were very specific to what's happening now. Sure. And I found the way that he answered these to be quite interesting. So I'm going to fast forward to a question at the 50-minute mark, where he's actually asked about amassing troops to the border, 100,000 troops specifically. And I found, and the one thing that has always been the case with people is people don't lie well, and people that are intelligent, and this is why people dodge questions. There's two types of people, I think, that, when you ask them a question and they need to be deceitful, or the answer isn't going to be a positive answer or benefiting to them. If you were to outright lie, then people would be able to pick that apart. It's very difficult for people, even people as well trained as Vladimir Putin, to lie and not show any tics or signs or anything like that. And whenever you ask, like a killer, for example, did you murder somebody? Why would I do that? Well, why are you not answering the question?
Right.
And that's
answering a question with a question.
Which
is what he does, by the way, with the soul thing. I don't know. We have to define the soul, but go on.
So let's take a look here. Oh, by the way, double check is your mic on, by the way? It seemed like it went away.
It better be. Hello.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Yeah. Sorry. You might want to turn up the gain. Is it?
I don't have gain on this. It is I have to get a more fancy microphone at some point.
So let's go to the 50-minute mark where he is asked about his 100,000 troops. And I found his non-answer interesting.
In the case of neighboring Ukraine, earlier this year, the European Union said you had more than 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. Was that an attempt to get Washington's attention?
And by the way, he's got a translator, but it does, let's be honest, he understands English very well. and he speaks English very well.
Mhm.
Во-первых, мы проводили,
First,
во-первых, сама Украина
Ukraine itself
постоянно
constantly,
оттаскивала, ну, по-моему,
and I
сейчас
think
продолжает еще
is still
состав
doing
военную
that.
технику в район.
It kept bringing personnel and military equipment to the conflict area in the southeast of Ukraine, Donbass. That's one. Two is that we conducted exercises in our territory, and not just in the south of the Russian Federation, but also
На Дальнем Востоке,
in
и
the
на
Far
севере
East and in the north and in the Arctic.
одновременно проводили
Simultaneously,
несколько
military exercises were being held in different parts of the Russian
В
Federation.
это же время США
At the very
проводили
same
учения
time,
на
the
Аляске.
US was conducting military exercises in Alaska.
Вы знаете об этом?
Do you know anything about it? Probably not. But I'll tell you that I do know.
Dick.
And that
Но
is
это на вашей
in direct
территории.
proximity to
Вы
our
даже на это
borders.
внимание не обратили.
But that's in your territory, on your land. We didn't even pay attention to it.
На нашей
What is happening now? Now, at our southern borders, there is a war game, Defender Europe.
Значит, 40 тысяч
40,000
солдат,
personnel,
15
15,000 units of military equipment.
часть из
Part
них
of them
переброшены
have
с
been
американского
airlifted from the
континента
US
прямо к нашим
continent
границам.
directly to our borders.
Мы перебросили
Did
свою
we
технику
airlift
на
any of our
американскую
military technology to the US borders? No,
А что вы думаете?
we did not.
And many of those
Why?
I found that to be a really interesting answer, given where this happened, where things ended up 8 months later. And I think this is a good example of what you were talking about in his last answer. And he's equivocating something that isn't at all relative. Well, it's somewhat relative. And the reporter at one point does call him up on whataboutism. It didn't do it very successfully, but that is a key point, because he doesn't want to say, no, I'm not moving those 100,000 soldiers in one go down to the border, for any specific reason. He's equivocating to, well, there's, Ukraine are sending troops here and there. And did you know the US have been doing military maneuvers in Alaska? So why is this a problem? He never answers the question as to what was the intent of moving 100,000 soldiers in one go down to the border of Ukraine.
Yes, he doesn't. Very clearly doesn't. And, this is the same thing. I know we're going to look at it in a few minutes. But to me, when you look at his speech, he's doing that whataboutism, or what this, that. I mean, troop movements in Alaska, I don't know if he's even telling the truth or not. I suspect not. But, if the United States was, I don't know what military exercises the United States have been conducting in Alaska. But if they were, he knows, the American people know it had nothing to do with any kind of, posturing towards Russia.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, no,
There is, I'm pretty sure there is, because that is considered not a hostile border, because there's a point up there in Alaska where I think it's only like a mile or 2 miles or something between Russia and America and Siberia.
Oh, sure. Right.
And there
Sarah
are-
Palin can see Russia from her house and all
Yes,
that.
yes, of course. But there is some truth that there is a very short border, and there are military exercises that go on there, which you would expect.
But it's a
he's
water border. I mean, it's not a border. It's not a land border. It's not Ukraine and Russia.
You
You know what I mean? Like, you
he's
still
not
got.
wrong- But he's not wrong about that. But the intent of that's been going on for years, and military exercises go on borders on regular basis, and there is posturing. But he equivocated it to that, which isn't linked to why are you moving 100,000 soldiers. He also equivocated it to soldier presence in Donbass, which is another area like Crimea that's very Russia friendly. I don't know, Russia leaning, or they're very Russian identifying. And you can understand that Ukraine, being its own country, is worried that Russia is going to come in, or whatever's going on there is going to lead to civil war. So yes, it makes sense for Ukraine to send soldiers to that region, and that's their thing to deal with. But it doesn't answer the question, why are you moving 100,000 soldiers to the border all of a sudden?
Well, yeah, I'm looking at the border between Alaska. I'm wondering how many miles. Do I have a scale here? There's a tiny little island. You have these tiny little, this tiny little Alaskan town, Wales.
It's not the same. It's not.
It's not. No, it's ridiculous. It's freaking ridiculous.
Yeah, but it's sort of his methodology in this interview is interesting, because it sounds like he's giving sound bites or propaganda for. It's almost like a flat earther trying to advertise to other flat earthers what the arguments are this week. Because he's doing the interview in Russian, he can clearly speak English. He understands what's going on, and the answers he's giving are sort of like, this is what I want you all to know. So I'm advertising these points that may or may not be related, but you got them in the arsenal now. If anybody starts questioning Russia. So then at 5151, questions about this. This is a big thing for him. This next question at 5151 about NATO strengthening, and this is a big sort of narrative he keeps coming back to.
Response to your actions, Mr. President, do you worry that your opposition to NATO has actually strengthened it? For 6 years, NATO has spent more on defense.
And interesting, I wanted to comment on that. I would say NATO is more resolved, and the world is more sort of supportive of Ukraine staying in. You know, this is now more of an issue that Russia is going to struggle with because of these actions. I think, if anything, there's more resolve against sort of that motivation of Russia trying to, you know, exercise its authority on Ukraine and on those former Soviet countries.
Yes. I mean, that is, I think, really the bottom line motive. I mean, listen, Vladimir Putin is, you know, how old is he? Like, he's getting into his,
That's a good question.
He's getting in. I think he's getting into his early 70s. He is, you know, of a dying generation.
69.
69. Okay. He's of a dying generation that remembers the glory days of the Soviet Union and is becoming more and more nostalgic for them as time goes on. Of course, he wasn't really, you know, I mean, the glory days of the Soviet Union, to the degree that they existed, were, you know, probably before he was, you know, even himself much more than a child, because he would have been an apparatchik in the latter days, in the declining days of the empire. But he's probably, I think, he's gotten to the point that most, you know, autocrats get to. And I say autocrat, I just mean somebody who has like singular personal rule, like, so it could be a king, it could be an emperor, it could be whatever, but they start thinking about their legacy. Like, what legacy am I going to leave? And I think that as much as anything, personally, I think it's a psychological thing for him. Like, you know, I mean, you know, he's on the record, obviously, having questioned whether Ukraine should be a country at all. He views it as part of Russia. He views it as, you know, a symbolic. Not only it's huge economic, because Ukraine is the source of so much of the food. Even with, like, it fed the Soviet Union when it was part of the Soviet Union, right?
At one time, I think Russia too. And this is, I think, in 1941, one of the things that they wanted was access to the Black Sea, because that would really strengthen their empire, so to speak, having that Black Sea access, which I think is on the south of Ukraine.
Yes. Yes.
So let's see what he says, though, about NATO, because he's got a big hate boner for NATO. And should be playing.
That's some defense. Some defense. During the USSR era, Gorbachev, who is still, thank God, with us, you can ask him, got a promise, a verbal promise. However, it was a promise that there would be NATO expansion to the east. Where are those promises? 2 waves of expansion.
Where is that written down? Where is that promise written down?
Right. Well done. Well done. Correct. You've got a point. Got you good. Well, congratulations. Of course, everything should be sealed and written on paper. But what was the point of expanding NATO to the east and bringing this infrastructure to our borders?
So, and that is something we're going to see him talk about quite a bit in his speech. His narrative that he's trying to deliver is about NATO encroaching, and there's almost a narrative that NATO is trying to take away sort of the identity and you know, take over the Russian state. And this is a big piece of his narrative here. And I don't understand, like, how that is a thing. Because if he were to occupy Ukraine, that is now more so an issue, because now there's one less border between Russia and NATO.
Well, I mean, I think
recently,
that you're starting to see, like, I don't know that his plan stops at Ukraine necessarily, right? Because Belarus joined, right? Or is, you know, and Belarus is to Ukraine's north. And once you're in Ukraine, you can probably roll into Moldova. And then, of course, you're going to look at Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I can't believe they're not more on his target list than they have shown so far, only because it was them who I believe began the breakup of the Soviet Union. They were the 3 initial republics to break away: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So, I mean, I think that, the whole NATO thing. I mean, remember, NATO is not a national act. I mean, I know he's trying to paint NATO as just a puppet of the United States, and probably even is a degree to which that is true to some way of thinking. On the other hand, it is, at least theoretically, legally, and on paper, and this is his problem, it is a confabulation of nations like the UN, and it's something that somebody can join or not join. And if Ukraine wants to join it, and that's always been like the bone of contention for him, right? Is like, that's where he wants to draw a line in the sand. Ukraine's not allowed to join NATO. Well, who the hell is he to tell, Ukraine who they can and can't join? You know what I mean? That's really, that's this national self-determination piece.
But and he makes his argument here in his speech, actually. He formulates it based on some historical references here. So in his speech, I want to pick it up just so we're not spending too much time, but just to kind of give you the layout, he articulates his speech on NATO moving in, and he gives his reason. Well, actually, let me speed it up a bit just so we can play it without it going too long here. And I'll mute it so it's all in subtitles. So he starts by talking about eastward expansion of NATO is a massive issue for Putin, and Donbass, which he is himself declared Donbass, and what is the other region?
Oh, what's the name of the other region? Yes,
Donetsk,
I think, yes, but
he has declared them sovereign nations, and they're part of Ukraine. So he's already getting involved in Ukraine.
Luhansk.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So fundamental threats which are responsible to Western politicians created from Russia. So he starts talking about over the next, I guess, 10 minutes, he starts to make this case that NATO, which is heavily influenced by the US, they're almost like going through a land grab and trying to, instill their values and their sovereignty on all of these nations. And he references Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Yugoslavia, which you can make an argument that some people have made an argument in many of those conflicts that NATO should or should not have gotten involved. But he's using that as sort of a scare tactic, or that is his concern that Russia could turn into one of these states that NATO is going to be bombing to overturn their way of life. And he keeps referring back to, he doesn't directly refer to the good old days of the Soviet Union, but he refers to the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, and how Ukraine was part of that. And which I find interesting, because Ukraine is actually, I think, older than Russia. And Russia was born from Kiev, I think I read.
Yes.
And this region is so difficult to, you would, even somebody who's their doctorate in, let's say, Ukrainian history wouldn't cover the number of conflicts that have happened over geopolitical reasons for the last however many hundreds of years.
Right. Well, I mean, the part of the issue is that the idea of the European, and I have some books on this. In fact, one that I got for Christmas, and I got to get around to reading. But I'm reading a book by Shlomo Sand, I believe, and it's about Israel. But it's about like this, the question in general that dominated the 19th and 20th century politics, especially 20th century geopolitics, was the idea of the nation state. The idea that there's such a thing as an ethno-linguistic discrete group of people, like the English, and they speak, who are in England, you have the English people who speak English, and France, you have French people who speak French, and so then you have Russia is Russian, but the question is like, well, Ukraine, that's where the whole idea that there should be a Ukrainian state, I guess, comes from, out of they briefly organized prior to the Bolshevik takeover, and then subsuming it into the Soviet Union. A Ukrainian state, but there's a Ukrainian language, the Ukrainian people, and so after the breakup of the Soviet Union, it's like, well, shouldn't we have this same kind of ethnic state that exists elsewhere. But of course, the problem is that there is a bit of a slippery, it's one of those things that's a definition of convenience. Like, I think it can be surprising to people if you don't study it, myself included, until I started reading it. Like, not everybody in France speaks French, and it's not just people who just moved there to be refugees from, like, wherever, Libya or Sudan or something like that. It's, there are parts of France where French is not necessarily the primary language spoken, and that's why you get like fights over the border, especially the border areas of these countries, because where does French, like, think about Switzerland, which obviously isn't tied to one language. Where does one language stop being spoken and another language start being spoken? Where do they meet and intermingle? Like that kind of stuff. So,
but I find that the thing I find, and for all those watching, you can see here that the title of the video, I recommend watching it. And I was fascinated picking this apart because his speech is made up of two things. One, he's making a case against NATO. He's making a case that NATO, influenced by the US, are trying to encroach on the motherland.
Can I just say one thing about that? Which I mean, the part of this, my take on the speech is just slightly. I agree with what you said, except that I would say that he's maybe more subtly, he's trying to paint NATO as like the United States' proxy arm. Like, the United States, so that NATO is not, I mean, his objection to NATO isn't so much NATO qua NATO. It's that NATO is there to basically allow the United States to impose its version of foreign policy without having to have its legal, without having to have its self and government directly behind it. So it doesn't look like, it's the US doing this, it's NATO. That would be his argument.
Yeah. And that was his point where he made about you don't see Russia moving, ordnance to the border of the USA, but the US are doing it via in proxy with the NATO, moving ordnance onto the border of Ukraine and Russia via NATO. So he very much does, his case against the US is his case against NATO, and saying, they're effectively like a puppet for the US in many respects. But the thing I find really interesting is his example, of Libya, of Iraq, of Syria. He's using that as an example as to, why US and NATO are meddling in other countries' businesses, and we shouldn't be meddling. And now his next step is, how are we going to meddle in Ukraine and their problems? And it goes back to his lack of acceptance that Ukraine is still a country, and he does reference their sovereignty still. But at the 1522 mark,
because that what makes me the thing that I keep coming back to in pop culture that reminds me of Vladimir Putin. You remember Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace?
Yeah.
And at some point, Darth Sidious is talking to those two trade guys, aliens, and they're like, well, he says, okay, I want you to start the invasion of the planet of Naboo. And one of them says, is that legal? And he answers, I will make it legal. And I think, and honestly, I've been thinking about that since this started. And I think that that's Vladimir Putin. I mean, obviously, the claim that this is about Donbass and Luhansk, and their right to self-determination, and that he's there to keep the peace, is step one in trying to make it legal. And in other words, like, he's trying to do, he's introducing arguments and mental gymnastics in an effort to legitimize what he is doing, but ultimately what he is doing is, so it's in his interest, in other words, to claim that Ukraine continues to have a national sovereignty, and that sovereignty is somehow being upended or undermined by an international influence that overrides the will of the people, and that the national right to self-determination belongs to the people, not the government. And and that's how he's going to run that argument,
even though the people of the entirety, the totality of Ukraine, by more than 90%, support a free and independent Ukraine.
For sure.
And it is so rich for him to say, those damn Americans, stop meddling in shit that doesn't matter to you, Syria, Libya, Iraq. So let's talk about how we're gonna get into Ukraine and start fucking shit up so that we can get the outcome we want there. Because all of these Nazis, from back in the day, they're still kind of running things. But we'll get to that. So from
Yeah, the
1520,
fact that he tries to paint Ukraine that's the most outrageous part of all this. If we're going to go
Yes.
denazify Ukraine, you must be joking.
So
But
let's
go
play.
on.
Let's play this from here. I'm going to let this play at slightly faster but normal. Actually, I'll go normal 1.25. And I'm going to. This is more interesting because now
You
he's
should just read it
transitioning.
as we go along.
Well, so now, yeah, I will do actually. We'll be transitioning. He is transitioning now from his case against NATO to he's got this tenuous link between NATO and then Nazis and nationalists who are influencing Ukraine as an independent country. Not that he's considering them that, to want to become members of NATO. So he's not doing a good enough sales job on the Nazis. He needs to go in there and just get them out because it is the Nazis in this, which we'll get to that. So let's start playing and I'll read it. So let me go back. I jumped a bit too far ahead here. So he says, the problem is that in territories adjacent to Russia, which I have to note is our historical land, which is arguable. You know, he's referring to the USSR, which is a snapshot in time, the Soviet Union. And again, you know, Russia was...
And they were probably under the Tsar. I mean, Ukraine, I'm pretty sure for much of that. I mean, what is now Ukraine, that literal physical territory was part of Russian Empire under the Tsar, at least at times.
Well, it was. I know that Russia was born of Kiev, and
right?
Ukraine
And I think it was also part of the Ottoman Empire at times. That's the thing.
It's I've done a crash course just to try to understand some of this, but to be able to say that the USSR is the be all and end all of you know history in this part of the world is you know, yes, there was a point when Ukraine was a part of that you know, part of the Soviet Union. They're now not.
I'm going to give a 30-second plug to a website for all of our 250 odd subscribers, to a website called Geacron. That's GEACRON.com. It is a historical atlas where you can put in a year and look at the borders of the world in any given year. It's absolutely an astounding tool to have. So, like, you know, if I go to 1910, so pre-World War II, pre-breakup of the Ottoman Empire.
Do you want to share your screen?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm doing it on my desktop, so I can't.
No, don't worry about it. It's fine.
Yeah, like at that point, Kyiv is part of, yes, the Tsarist Russia. And the Ottoman Empire at that point had shrunk considerably. So yeah, it was there. But if you go back to, like, I don't know, 1789, let's say. Well, it was in the Poland, Lithuania. Interesting.
This region has gone back and forth.
Yeah, no, that whole Central Europe has been a political football for.
So to say Russia is the arbiter of what goes on in Ukraine, you know, there's a lot of Ukrainians that might argue that point. You know, from a heritage perspective. The problem is that the territories adjacent to Russia, which I have to note is our historical land, a hostile anti-Russia is taking shape. So the country next door has got some anti-Russia things going on. And then he says, fully controlled from the outside, it is doing everything to attract NATO armed forces and obtain cutting-edge weapons. So this is going back to that whole narrative that, yeah, they're stocking up with NATO. For the United States and its allies, it is a policy. Oh, balls. I need to slow this down. I'm going to slow this down a scotch because he is I still have it on 1.5. For our country, it is a matter of life and death and a matter of our historical future as a nation. This reminds me of some of the Hitler, not that, well, maybe he will be comparative, but like Hitler. Hitler was very much, you know, pulling at the heartstrings of you know, nationalism and, you know, the future of our nation depends on
and historical territories, right? So, like, for example, like, you know, what was he after in Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, the German speaking areas of what was Czechoslovakia after World War I, or in France, it was like the Alsace-Lorraine, right, which is the territory on the border between France and Germany. Where there's both English and French and German speaking people. And, like, I think that's the first thing he was marching into, if I recall correctly. in when World War II got underway. When he started his westward advance. So anyway, yeah, I mean, but those kinds of things, it's like, but it's that nationalistic, that like, that's our historical land. There's German speaking people there. I'm there to go free the German people. Yeah, that's what he's claiming in I'm sorry, Lhaska and I'm trying to remember the names of the provinces right now in Ukraine, right? That there are Russian speaking majorities there. That's his basic claim.
And he goes on to say, it is not only the very real threat to our interests, but the very existence of our state and to its sovereignty. And I just have to question, does historically NATO and the United States, how often have they physically? So I guess he's using Libya as an example, as an equivalent to Russia as a massive entity that anybody right now is afraid of engaging with. So the reason people aren't sending troops into Ukraine is they're afraid of engaging this juggernaut that is Russia and the Russian military. And if they're willing to go into Ukraine, I think there's a sense that they have some pretty big bad ordnance that can cause some damage. And if they're happy to go into Ukraine, which is not a third world country,
no,
there's nothing to say they wouldn't do that elswhere. And
they've already vaguely threatened it, right? I mean,
yes,
I mean, like, yeah.
Yes, and Russia. What was I going to say? I'll have to come back to it. I've lost my thought.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you were saying that like people are unwilling to engage with Russia because, I mean, it's like a little bit of like, if they're capable of invading Ukraine and they're capable of pushing in and occupying, taking over, then that says something about their military strength, and it's not somebody, you want to poke the bear, as it were.
But I think, and this is the problem with the way, Putin having had control for so long. I don't think this military conflict was agreed by a group of joint chiefs and a vote. I think this decision was unilaterally made by their president. And that's a scary thing when it comes to these types of decisions. And it's why people, I think, are afraid in engaging, because there's not a lot of layering that goes into making decisions as to who we attack and when.
I mean, I'm outside. I'm not an expert, but I would say that this, to me, from the outside, is the danger. I mean, internally for Vladimir Putin, internal to Russia, which is that he seems to be fighting a 70-year-old man's war. Yeah. I'm sure people his generation and older, and maybe a little younger, feel this kind of nostalgia for the glory bygone days of the Soviet Union, and maybe even the younger generation to an extent, even though they don't remember it, don't know it as well.
Yeah,
because there are things, about current geopolitics. There's always sort of things were better back then. It's like one of the classic human, like, it's just everywhere. People think that.
I guarantee. Sorry, mate.
Well, no, I'm just going to say, but having said that, I would think that people under about 40, especially the people who have to go serve as soldiers, I just don't know how much attachment emotionally they have to the idea that Ukraine should be part of this, of some greater Russia. And like, he's, in other words, fighting a war for the way things used to be. Like if you let Donald Trump fight a war to try to, like, make the United States 1957 again or whatever. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's not going to be of interest to people who are 25 and 30.
But he's trying to, even here, look at this part of the screen here. Yeah. Russia has money and technology. They're very advanced. He's got 3 fucking phones here that are landlines. Like this is a very old school setup here. And it makes me wonder if this is deliberate. And there's tape on this damn thing here too. This is very Soviet looking. Even just this office setup is not modern. Putin probably, I question whether he knows how to use an iPhone. But like he's very back in the day, and this to me just has Eastern Bloc Soviet sort of yellow off-white telephones, landlines with cords. It's very like this is I would see this going back. I'm going to reference Columbo in every episode. I would expect to see this in an office of a business that Columbo's investigating. This right here.
Maybe not the bottom one. The bottom one's a little more 90s.
But it's a little more 90s.
Maybe late 80s, but I hear what you're saying. Like, it's an interesting point. You're right. They do stick out, and people think about these things. The composition of these types of shots and what you're saying. Yeah, it is. That's a very good point. I like. It's
very interesting. Mm-hmm. So he's talking about the red line. So he seems to believe that the red line has been crossed, and they have crossed it. So he's referring to they being not the people in Ukraine, not the Nazis or the nationalists. He's referring to NATO right now, who aren't even in Ukraine as such.
Right. They're in Poland, right?
So this brings me to the situation in Donbass. We can see that the forces that staged the coup in Ukraine in 2014 have seized power, are keeping it with the help of ornamental election procedures. So he doesn't believe that the sovereignty is being, kept up appropriately, that the political system in Ukraine is not working, which is ironic coming from Vladimir Putin, who has pretty much, strong-armed his way into power and kept power, and have abandoned the path of peaceful conflict. For 8 years, for 8 endless years, we've been doing everything possible to settle the situation by peaceful political means. Again, in a country that isn't your country. So it's same thing that he hates, he's doing.
Well, the thing is that some of this is about geopolitical power politics, I'm sure. And so it's interesting that I teach a class, and I mentioned, and I don't usually do this kind of thing, but I mentioned in passing the ongoing conflict, and basically expressed my opinion that it didn't look like, the invasion of Ukraine, and particularly Kyiv, was going as Vladimir Putin had drawn it up. And I then kind of gave like a little fist bump like that, or thumbs up, like that. And I have a student this semester from Turkey, and he said to me after class, because of course Turkey is also not a NATO country and is being run by Erdogan, right, for the last several more than several. He started out as like seemingly somebody who was good for the country kind of strong political leader, but has increasingly consolidated power around himself. And this Turkish student of mine said, like, well, people don't realize that, like, NATO, that they were building up, NATO is building up defense stuff in Poland near the border, and like they were being asked. So like it was interesting to talk to somebody who was, I think, perfectly willing to, and not in a disingenuous way. He's not a propaganda, he's not like a Russian student who's like invested in Vladimir Putin or believes he's, what I mean? Like he's there saying, this is what I was taking from this is like, his news sources and the things he listened to are providing this other narrative. And, I read a very good, sort of guess at what the strategy here is for Putin, which I thought was interesting, which is that to try to basically rebalance political power a little bit in the world, that if Russia can become full allies with China, first of all, you don't think China's not watching this and keeping their eye very firmly on Taiwan. Yes, I mean, so you have that, and then if between China and Russia, they control a lot of the world's silicon. That's and so like, if they could form sort of, Turkey, they have like-minded governments, like-minded, value systems in terms of both how a government ought to be organized and the notion of individual, quote unquote, liberty. And I don't mean like, I don't want to be glib about that. That's not necessarily about, we in America believe in freedom and they don't. More about like the role of the state and the role of the individual and the relationship between the two. And they just have, a much from the United States and from the West, generally, they have a different point of view. And obviously you have autocratic leaders at the head of all three. And when you throw in like, they could get Saudi Arabia to switch sides. I mean, you could start forming a real East-West bloc where they would have a lot of the Earth's natural resources that the West depends on, namely in terms of oil and silicon.
It's such a strategic. I mean that makes a lot of what we're seeing here, just the geopolitical power play, really, and it really does hammer home that all of this is just window dressing to a means to an end, and that all of this, I would say that is more of an outlier, because I do think that Vladimir Putin has this. I think. He feels really hard done by that this great Soviet Union is, was destroyed by the influence of the West, and the US had a lot to do with motivating that breakup and those countries becoming independent. They were pulling strings from what was a fragile country, I guess, at that point. But and Putin, I think the U.S. has always been on his list of "I'll get you before I die."
Yeah. I mean, I think from that psychological point of view, like I agree. I mean, I think that there could be a geopolitical power play, but there's also just the satisfaction of a certain level of ego.
Yeah.
You know that. Yeah.
And this is where he's referred. So this is the bit where he said focused. He's referring to, he referred to genocide, stopping the millions of people that are being killed. And I'm not familiar of any genocide in Ukraine. I was considering
No.
going to Kiev on holiday. And I tend not to go to places on holiday where genocide is a thing.
Right.
But maybe I'm misinformed. Who knows?
Yeah, well, you know that the most ridiculous part. I mean, the most flagrantly ridiculous
I know
part
what you're
about
going to say.
calling. Yeah, you know what I'm going to say. Well, then go ahead and say it.
The Jewish president of the country. So
Right.
those
That takes balls. That takes real balls for Vladimir Putin to, claim that the government of Ukraine, headed by Michael Zelensky, is neo-Nazi.
he's referring here, and this is a good time for this in this speech for us to talk about it. Focused on their goals, the leading NATO countries are supporting the far right nationalists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine. The neo-Nazis. So the neo-Nazis are doing such a good job. They allowed a Jewish president to be elected.
Correct.
And when we talk about far right nationalists, we're talking about people that are, you could argue that they're people that are politically proud of Ukraine as a country. And that's shouldn't be something that's problematic to Putin. If anything, he supports their sovereignty and their identity as Ukrainians, according to him.
Yeah, where does he say that does he actually outright say I support their identity as Ukrainian?
No, but that's what you can. That's a. To be fair, I'm stringing one and one together here, but
yeah.
You can assume that he wants the people of Ukraine to believe that we're just trying to make sure that your independence is secured from these awful people. And when you say that we want to respect your sovereignty, I mean the definition of that in itself is governing yourself, controlling your own future. It's not
invading.
Yes, which is a big part of sovereignty. This is it's one of the biggest ironies in all of this.
Right. I mean, he's trying to thread a very difficult needle, which obviously is to carry off an invasion, but also say it's in the name of Ukrainian sovereignty, which he will try to redefine as that Ukrainian's been taken over from within by Western influences that don't reflect the real values of Ukrainian people. They reflect a globalized, westernized culture that is not in keeping with the traditional values of your average rank and file Ukrainian or Russian or whatever, right? And that their prior attachment to the Soviet Union is reflective of a longer tradition of Ukraine being part of Russia and being more of an Eastern country rather than a Western country, and all of that implies. I mean, that's his attempt to justify this.
Yeah.
And of course, you could say and look, he would know a thing or two about this, because after all, in Russia, he wins his elections 95% to 5%, 96% to 4%. So
pretty good.
Yeah, he knows what the will of the people looks like. On the other hand,
yes, so just sort of skipping ahead here, but I think we've kind of got the gist, and I find it interesting here that as far as what his motivations are, as far as right now, his motivations in this speech and in his interview that he gave to whatever, I forget his name already, to NBC News is really just selling his people, who I believe he's aware that the Russian people are probably not, if he were to have a vote, do you want us to invade Ukraine? I would expect there would be, if they felt free to vote any way they wanted to, a vast majority would be completely against this whole war in general. You have soldiers who are shooting on, people that share lineage. There's people that live across the border. A lot of Ukrainians, have family or spend time in Russia and vice versa. They speak the same language, and in some you're talking about a few blocks away from each other in some parts. So this is a sales job, not just to to the world, but to the Russian people, just saying, here's why you need to get behind this. And the one thing that stands out about this conflict versus any other, this is the first invasion that people are trying to cancel. And that is an interesting prospect. Facebook has, I think, dumped itself out of Russia. You know, the world is trying to, the world is trying to motivate people via social media to not do business with Russia. Football teams are when I say football teams, I'm talking about British football teams are and Formula One teams are sacking off people and players that are Russian. I think one of the F1 teams has fired one of their drivers because they're Russian, because of the conflict. Nothing personal, but we don't want to have a Russian driver because of the shit that's going on.
I think there's two interesting points. I like the way you put that, the idea that it's an attempt to cancel the invasion. And I know that the cancel culture can be a sore point for people, but in this case, it's, kind of an interesting way of putting it and thinking about it, because it's a way to wage war without waging war, right? Yeah. And specifically, I think there's two kind of points tied into what you were saying that I was thinking. On the one hand, just to continue with that for a moment, I think, there's a lot of suspicion on the right and the left in this country of globalization as a general trend, because it tends to be something that's viewed, I don't think unfairly or even incorrectly, as something that tends to favor, and I'm going to talk in old school Marxist terms here, capital versus labor. What I mean by that is that, in a globalized economy, wealthy people get insanely wealthy because, first of all, they're able to, if you could imagine a world without literally any borders, that's exactly what, for example, NAFTA was about here in the United States when it was first set. Like, it's basically, let's, really reduce the amount of regulation and tariffs and whatnot so that United States companies can not just do business with Mexico or business with Canada, but like run their business out of Mexico, run their business out of Canada. And the next thing you saw were factories in, Flint, Michigan, and other areas in, northern Michigan, northern Ohio, shutting their doors, automobile factories, and moving their operations to Mexico. And what they were doing by doing that, of course, is reducing their labor costs, because that's what globalization is. This is why the left is very suspicious of it, in terms of like the hard socialist left is like, this is about, capital always has a much greater ability to move itself. There's always inherent costs with moving, but capital can kind of like shut up the factory. And especially if there's a big environment where it's cheaper to build, cheaper to hire, even though there's cost associated with shutting down a factory, and there's, investment in materials and things and moving materials that you're walking away from when you shut down a factory, you're going to more than make up for it on the back end when you move it to a place where you can do things for pennies on the dollar, like Mexico. Right. So that's the left suspicion. The right suspicion tends to be about the cultural exchange piece. So like in your country right now, and I know there's still that Brexit thing. It's the idea that like, oh, these people are coming, these immigrants are here and they're changing our country. It's not our country anymore. It's increasingly globalized. And I don't recognize the culture, and the things that were important aren't important anymore. But both it's funny how the far left and the far right have the same set of suspicions expressed differently about the center, and the globalization is the center. But here in this conflict, I think you are seeing, if there is, there are legitimate criticisms to be leveled against globalization, but this conflict at the moment, if they work, the sanctions are showing you hopefully what the positive side of it is, rather than erupting into a total world war when Russia's every bit of every economy is so tied in with every other economy. And when being shut out of, like, if you had protectionism, the idea that each country was its own sort of like ring fence, totally independent operating thing, then to a certain degree, they can operate independently of one another. And if one declares war on the other, economic sanctions against it doesn't really affect it. Like, so what? I'm not trading with you. But when every Russian dollar is in banks all throughout Western Europe and the United States, and you cut those things off, now all of a sudden the ruble collapses. Like, you can take their economy and turn it to shit overnight, which we did. And then, you know what I mean? And without firing a shot. And that's the advantage of globalization. And so you have, like, I think this is an interesting conflict in the sense that it's going to show the advantages of it, but it's being fought for and rhetoricized by the Russians against an older, non-globalized sort of rhetoric. And then the other piece that I think is interesting, I'm sorry to go long-winded on this, is that, notice how closely Vladimir Putin's criticisms actually mirror the right's criticisms in the United States, or their narrative in the United States. Like, if you think about what Vladimir Putin's saying about how, Ukraine has been taken over by people who don't represent the will of the people. It's a globalized intelligentsia who are trying to force a way of living that's against the cultural norms of the Ukrainian people. This is not what they want. They're illegitimate. This sounds awfully like what Donald Trump is, and that version of right-wing rhetoric is being pushed here. That that there's a Harvard elite that are completely out of touch with the desires of rank and file Americans, and they're illegitimately elected. They're using their technology and their access to certain kinds of power to make deals amongst themselves, and they're freezing out regular rank and file everyday Americans. And both strategies are meant to destabilize the sitting government, because question its legitimacy. In Vladimir Putin's case, he's literalizing it with an invasion, and Donald Trump came awfully close to really leading one of those himself on January 6th, 2021. So
it's you talk about the one thing that occurs to me just listening to you talk about that. When you talk about capitalism, and a lot of the tenets of capitalism this is my uneducated view. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you have complete freedom, to build your business any way you want to, and to be as rich, the richest fuck in the world if you want to be. That's capitalism.
Sure.
But then the second you're like, you know what?
Yeah.
What's that?
In its idealized version, yeah.
And in that idealized version, I want to get richer. Therefore, I want to go to Mexico, where the dollar is a bit stronger and the wages are a lot cheaper. Well, wait. We were talking capitalism, but not all the way capitalism. We want you to do what you want, but you know what? This isn't too suitable to sort of this big picture here, this society here in the US or wherever else. And then you start getting those, and this is where we get stuck in left land and right land, because we lose that context and nuance of, okay, well, there is some middle ground here that we need to work our way through. And this very much is, when we talk about Brexit, again, same sort of thing. You have people that are worried about identity politics, and they're worried that Britain is not going to look like Britain. It's going to look like, the Middle East or whatever. And that's what people keep saying. Or there's all these Polish people coming over and taking our jobs. And I want to stress that the Polish people are working hard doing jobs that the British people on welfare aren't touching. But that said, when you look at these sort of things from, the British people that I speak to, who, let's say, were pro-Brexit, and I don't argue with them about it, but what I struggle with is these same British people who wanted to have an independent Britain, who wanted to be separate from Europe, are the same people who are really pissed off that they've lost their house in Spain because they can no longer live there full time because they're no longer part of the European Union.
It's the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think it's all of these things, people are afraid of. It's like, okay, well, if you don't want people to move their business elsewhere, we need to sell them on an idea. We need to get them on board with something. You can't just force people to do things. You need to sell narratives.
Right.
And people are worried about their identity going. I've never lived in Britain and thought, you know what, I don't know what country I'm in. I've never said that. I've never felt like this wasn't the British culture, and people are worried about losing a culture that wasn't getting lost anyway.
Well, it's interesting from somebody who doesn't live there, and isn't. I actually read a very interesting sort of commentary on a quote from John Cleese, right? So John Cleese was complaining like he doesn't like going to London anymore, as I recall. I mean, like, I'm paraphrasing here, but like that it's just not the way it used to be. And somebody else commented and said, I think I kind of want to agree with John Cleese here if he means what I mean when I think that, but I don't think he means what I mean. I think he means like in the old man kind of, it's just not British anymore. And I think he said something like that, it's not, and it's what you're talking about. There's just too much international this, too much that, you know what I mean? It's got this, it's become less of an English city and more of a global hub, if you will, like New York, like
and it
Los
is, to
Angeles,
be fair,
Tokyo, But what the person who was commenting on this said, like, I kind of like want to agree with him in the sense that this is the side of globalism that I think we can all kind of agree with to an extent. Places lose their individual flavor. Like when I was in England 20 years ago, I haven't been now in 13. And if I were to come out there, hopefully sometime soon, and you and I have been talking about that, I wonder, even I was noticeable from 2000 to 2008. like, oh, there's more just stuff that I recognize around, you know what I mean? That
Yeah.
wasn't specifically, and I'll bet now it's even more so that there's just, I mean, like, I think that the smallest version of this was observable inside the United States. When I was a kid and you would go to a grocery store, like we would sometimes take trips like down south or something like that for vacation, where we would drive into Virginia and North Carolina and stuff like that. And you would go to the grocery store, there would be a lot more differentiation between a grocery store down there and up where we lived than there is today, just in terms of like the number of local brands, things like that, regional differences. A lot of that, as stuff gets more and more centralized, nationalized, globalized, gets wiped out, and places do lose some of their individual flavor. I think it gets over exaggerated and over, these things are living cities. They're not museums. You know what I mean? They're not going to be frozen in time when you were 12 so that you can feel like great about it forever. You know what I mean? That's not the way the whole world is. Get the hell over it. Having said that, there is always something lost, when a place goes from being, basically regional and therefore fairly, from an outsider's perspective, it's going to be somewhat unique compared to, and I'm using a qualifier with unique, which you're not supposed to do, but compared to like other places. Whereas like, how much more does London look like New York, look like Toronto, look like Los Angeles now than they did, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Those kinds of questions.
But there is going to be parts of every city, and cities there's not much nuance you can add to cities without building something new that's definably not the way things were. And if I go into London and I go near Buckingham Palace, I am in fucking England. I am there. And when I go into New York City and I'm at Times Square, which America's weird, because America's identity is all new and very difficult to discern from other modern parts of the world. So the New York identity is a culture, and specifically Times Square, because it's sort of the first of that type of thing.
Sure. Of course, a lot of people will tell you they like old Times Square, back when New York let it go to hell, and it was a place for like, pay by the hour hotels, hookers, and the like,
But that's the thing. And that reminded me of sort of something I thought about, because there is truth to progress. You do lose things, change, and people don't like change. And the irony is, you talk about the old guys that hate. So I'm a member of a golf club, and we have a bunch of old guys that hate computers. They don't like what computers have done. But I bet most of those fuckers are loving online porn. There's a big dichotomy there. Massive dichotomy there.
I've never met one who didn't. I thank my lucky stars. I think that my father never discovered the computer and all of its possibilities.
These old guys like, oh, I can't stand this computer, Sean. What are you doing tonight? I'd rather not say. I'd rather not talk about it. I've got a date. Nobody's
we've gone pretty far from the subject, but I mean, I think like it's just interesting that the Ukrainian conflict, I mean, like looking at it in terms of how Vladimir Putin is selling it, it really is drawing these, and like it helps to me as I talk through this to explain why, recognizing how closely the rhetoric of Putin mirrors the rhetoric of certain brands of right-wing reactions to globalization, which is really what, a lot of, I mean, that's what nationalism in a sense is these days. It's that kind of nationalism or xenophobia. I mean, obviously it's ugly side, but it's the, reaction to like, I don't want my way of life to change. That's conservative impulse. And therefore it makes more sense. Like, why is there sympathy for Putin to some degree on the right? I mean, fortunately, I think American politicians are falling into line, even the ones who were, except for Donald Trump, the ones who were, maybe inclined to express admiration for, or otherwise, sympathy for Vladimir Putin and his positions, are starting to realize, no, I mean, the guy clearly just is, I wonder if he has a screw loose at this point, to be honest with you. But
there's people that believe he's got Parkinson's. So there was on that
syphilis, but okay.
Well, probably. But I was watching if anybody's watching this, you ever watch the body language panel? It made me think of this watching that. I can't dig into a video like they can, but I was very I was very interested in speaking to you about this, Dixon. But
Yeah.
The one guy worked in intelligence, and he's got some contacts, and he was pointing out that in this video here, just to bring it back up on the screen, he was talking about how the way he's kept his hands still on the desk, and how he said, if I were, oh, I took you off the screen. People are gonna drop out.
Maybe they'll just think I turned into Vladimir Putin.
Maybe I'm talking to you. The way his hands are sitting here, just sort of resting, not moving much, is what he would tell somebody who's trying to hide, or if he has Parkinson's and doesn't want that to be visible. And there was a few other, I don't know what it was, but he said he's heard a few things that would indicate that, you know, he may have Parkinson's. I'm not saying that that's the case, but there is a concern in the intelligence community.
I'm no expert, but I would think if you had Parkinson's, you were trying to keep your hands still, you'd hook the thumbs underneath the desk. And I noticed
I don't know. He just said I would have him just rest the hands and let the wrists be limp and just not move. I don't know. I'm just sharing information that I've heard, but he probably is, you know, this is his chance to get a push. It would have been really interesting. It would have been a disaster in my opinion, but if Trump had won the election, what the hell would this have looked like? This would have just, I mean, that would be for me, a scary proposition. And I know the people that watch this are Trump supporters. Hey, I don't have a problem with you being a Trump supporter, but in my opinion, he just is not an intelligent guy. And as a spokesperson, he's not very good. And this is a situation where you have to be tactful, you know, in your messaging politically. But I enjoyed this one, Dixon. I hope everybody watching this enjoyed this.
Yeah, it's a good talk. I love talking about, as you can see, that's actually a topic of mine, nationalism and the history of that whole concept. And actually also the notion of political freedom and the way it gets used politically, like, you know, what it means to be free. There's freedom from and freedom to. And those two things aren't always as in concert with one another as one would expect, right? Because freedom from certain levels of government involvement in one's life is not necessarily compatible with freedom to be able to be, like, let's say, well, freedom to, like, do stuff, the freedom from things like poverty and whatnot. You know, sometimes you need structures in place in order to allow people to live the best possible life. So, like, those two topics will come very close together to this the general question of globalism, and how I think the way that Putin is just obviously, to me, there's a line from the old movie Network where Ned Beatty's character is telling Howard Beale, who was played by Peter Finch, who received the Academy Award for playing that part of Howard Beale posthumously after the movie had come out. But he says to him, "You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and of peoples. There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are only dollars, yen, Deutschmarks, rubles." You know what I mean? Like, and that is really, he wrote that in 1975, and that was so bloody prophetic. So much of that movie is prophetic, but that's where we are right now. You got Vladimir Putin, who I think, I mean, I don't mean to, like, I don't think he's dumb. I think, you know, he's certainly himself financially invested enough in the world economy to understand. Like, I'm not suggesting he has no concept of how modern finance works, but I am saying that, like, certainly, if nothing else, politically, rhetorically, he's willing to sort of return to a kind of, you know, pre-globalized, or, you know, use that as an appeal to try to bring the Russian people onto his side as the cause for this invasion, which is a typical strategy.
And he's selling it from his perspective, which is very, he is the 1% perspective from life in the Soviet Union. And those were the good old years for him, but for maybe even less than the 1%, him and the 0.5% of people that lived in, you know, in that time. But hopefully we'll see. I did see something pop up on Twitter, like a news article, that he's had peace talks with the president of Ukraine, and there's a ceasefire for safe passage corridors. And hopefully,
I read that the ceasefire got broken by Russian troops. So,
well, I think there's going to be a point, if that's the case, if there's language that way, I would hope that with this canceling and with all of the actions, you know, the world fairly unilaterally, with the exception of maybe the key players, but there's a large, from my perspective, there's a fairly consistent message that people don't support these actions. And I think it's a scary idea that a country that big can just invade somebody else. I think that scares a lot of people. And I think there's going to be a point where Putin is not going to have the support of his countrymen. And he's going to start finding ways to have peace talks and to switch that narrative so that he can stay in power.
Well, I have an update from 40 minutes ago from the Associated Press, which says that Russian President Vladimir Putin warned Saturday that Ukrainian statehood is in jeopardy and likened the West's sanctions on Russia to declaring war, while a promised ceasefire in the port city of Mariupol collapsed amid scenes of terror in the besieged town. Now, having said that, that sounds a little bit like saber rattling, but yeah.
It's difficult to know what's true, even just reading that. But there is, if let's say that is a true statement, true story, we are as close to world war as I can, like in modern times. I mean, yeah, because if he were just to annex or bin the idea of Ukraine and make it, make it Russia, that's going to be problematic, especially since I think symbolically, I don't know if they actually have, but they've joined NATO, Ukraine. And I don't know to what weight that holds, given that that was more of an emergency declaration.
Wait, say that again?
Didn't the president of Ukraine sign something to joining NATO sort of symbolically or something to that effect?
Oh, I didn't read that, because I would think that there we go is wow. Oh, holy moly. Okay.
Maybe I misread that. I should edit that out.
Well, no, I mean, if I listen, I was tied up last night, so
I read something. I should probably edit that out. I'm just saying shit now.
Yeah.
President Ukraine join NATO.
Yeah, I mean, if
maybe
that
not. I think
I mean, I've read that, like, one of the probable conditions of a ceasefire that both sides would probably have to, I mean, like, it's Ukraine giving up something they don't have, but like a promise not to join NATO. I mean, like, that's, if you, at least a few days ago, there was a lot of talk about, like, it was looking like this thing was going pretty badly. Certainly it's not gone, I don't think, the way that Putin would have wanted in terms of, just being able to roll in and assert his will.
Can I jump in there actually on that? Because I watched this. There was a few things I watched about how the media are portraying Russian tactics, and there was a few videos I watched from soldiers who have YouTube channels, some of which claimed to study Russian, who have studied Russian military tactics, and they had pointed out, and I thought it was an interesting thing to talk about, that the media are incorrectly perceiving Russia's progress because the carriers and the tanks they're moving go about 80 kilometers before they need to be refueled. And what he said was, there's a few things I read, and there's 2 videos I saw on this, all of which were fairly consistently saying the way they work is they have these long convoys with fuel trucks stationed every so often. And what they do is, before they do an invasion, it takes ages because they position all of their pieces around the area that they plan to overwhelm. So a lot of the part of this war, and this is something that historically Russia, the Soviet Union, historically have been happy to give a lot of casualties in staging. And this is a process of getting those heavy pieces of equipment that require a hell of a lot of fuel into the position so they can then siege the cities. So there's people that expect that what we perceive as them going slow, and I'm sure the Ukrainians are putting an amazing fight up. They're not. It's not like it's a small country and an unskilled fighting force. However, that's not to say that Russia aren't going at the pace that they more or less expect, maybe a few days behind.
Well, I don't know. I guess we'll find out in the coming days, but.
Well, to anybody who's watched this long, God love you. God love you. Please subscribe, for Christ's sakes. But we're up to 253. Thank you to everybody who has watched this long. Next week, we're going to be picking up, we're going to be finishing. We were supposed to do it this week, and this was a bit of a diversion. We'll be finishing up Scott Peterson. Yes. And if you have any ideas, we've gotten a few from subscribers that we have, and we hopefully will get to at some point. We do have a bit of a list that we created when we started this. But Dixon, I really enjoyed it as always. Thank you so much.
Did. Thank you. This was a great idea.
All right, man. Well, we will catch up next week, and thank you, everybody. Have a good week. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.